Welcome to the final lesson on value and color. With this exercise, we're going to be looking at the two best methods for converting from color into black and white. And this will sort of complete our look at this multi-step process. We started off by looking at levels and curves adjustment layers. These are the fundamental building blocks for controlling value and for controlling contrast. And these are things you want to exploit with pretty much every image you ever use in Photoshop because they're that fundamental, that basic. But when it comes to the specific task of converting from color information to black and white, these two methods are the most precise. On the next lesson after levels and curves fundamentals, we took a look at how to apply those adjustment layers using layer masks in a more specific way, so that we can fine-tune the contrast and value of very specific parts of the image and then touching it all off with a dodge and burn layer. Now, that is one method for converting from color to black and white, and you can certainly exploit a lot of those techniques even with what I'm about to show you. But this method, I think, is kind of where most people would want to start if they're converting from color to black and white, to begin with this and then to fine-tune it with elements of that last lesson using curves and levels. So it's not a replacement for those processes we've looked at. This is really more of kind of just a more thorough beginning to the methodology of converting from color to black and white. There are two adjustment layers we're going to look at. One is the newer method that was added to Photoshop in more recent years, and that is the black and white adjustment layer. It's just called black and white. We'll start with that one, and then we'll take a look at the older method using the channel mixer and talk a little bit more about channels and what they can do for you. So to start off, go ahead and open up your rockshop.psd file. You'll be looking at a color photograph there in the desert that has very distinct characteristics. It's got a very blue sky and a very yellowish brown earth tone in the foreground, with a little hint of green sagebrush there in the background from, well, it's kind of hard to see, but if you zoom in a bit, we can start to see that, yeah, some of that sagebrush is not brown, but it's actually green mixed in with the brown. Not much of it, but it's there. Kind of typical California desert here. All right, so here we go. First things first, let's add an adjustment layer. So I'm going to go to the adjustment layer button, and we're going to pick, like I said, black and white. And so you should see the black and white heading there when you go to your adjustment layer. And so with this particular adjustment layer, there's often no need for the addition of layer masks, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't benefit from them. But more on that in a second. First, let's just understand what this does. You have several different sliders going from red to magenta, different sides of the color wheel. So we've got our red, green, and blue, RGB, and then we've got our cyans, yellow, and magenta from, the CMYK model. And they're all together here in one space to help you convert your color data into black and white. So how does that work? Well, for example, let's start with something that's very obvious in this photograph, the cyan blue sky. I'm going to take my cyan slider and drag it to the left, and you'll immediately see that I start to darken only the blue cyan elements of the image while leaving the brownish elements intact. If I go to the right, I'm going to bleach out those elements in the sky and get a nice white sky while leaving the building intact. Once again, without using any selection, without using any sort of layer mask or anything, I'm able to get these results. Now, the disadvantage with using this method is that yes, it's faster in the sense that I didn't have to mask it to get these results, but I'm also not able to completely isolate. In this photograph, as I showed you earlier, is fairly conducive to this process, but even if it weren't, you'll see that there are problems with certain specific areas. Say, for example, if I didn't want to lighten the sign, even though it doesn't really look that blue, it definitely has blue in it. So it is influenced when I do this, and you can see maybe I didn't want the building to be affected, only the sky. It does affect the building a little bit because the building is picking up on some of that bluish color in the atmosphere. So I guess what I'm saying is not as specific. That can have its positives and that can have its minuses. So ideally, you probably are going to need to mix the black and white filter with layer mask and do multiple versions of this to get exactly what you want. But let's see what we can do just using one adjustment layer without going to that level of control. So we can imagine our sky is pretty much going to be cyan and blue. So let's see what happens with the blue slider. Again, you can see I'm controlling it, but it's affecting more the top part of the sky as opposed to the middle part, which is more affected by the atmosphere, the haze. So it's a much darker blue. So the two of these together are going to team up beautifully to tackle that sky. But as I mentioned earlier, they will affect other elements of the photograph. Now the yellows are going to have a dramatic effect on, of course, the earth, which is very yellowish in this photograph. And so, as you can see, I'm able to drastically affect the earth and somewhat affect the rocks in the building. Let's take a look at red, because if you know color, you know there's going to be some red in that brown as well. And so here we go to the right and to the left, and you can see it's affecting very specific parts, mostly the sagebrush and certain parts of the sand or the dirt in front of it that have the most impact on red, but it's leaving the building fairly alone. It's not having a lot of influence on that building. We know there's some greens here in the sagebrush, but let's see if there's greens anywhere else. Let's grab that slider and just go to the right. You'll notice that there are some greens in that building. I mean, that building has got some cooler colors on it. It was not affected by the reds, but it is affected by the greens. So that's kind of interesting. Sometimes your eyes will play tricks on you and you don't really notice these things right away. It's not that obvious. So with those 5 sliders, we've already seen it that they all influence the photograph in their own specific ways. Now magenta, on the other hand, there are certain situations where you look at a photograph and you say, well, I don't really see that color represented. Let's figure out if there's some hiding in it. And in the case of magenta, there's really not much there. And you can see as I go back and forth to these extremes, there's little to no influence on the photograph at all. So sometimes your eyes play tricks on you, other times they don't. It just really, sometimes you just have to play with the sliders to know exactly what you're going to get. So that's essentially it. There's not a whole lot to tell you with this. It's really quite straightforward. So let's say I wanted to go for a higher contrast type of image. I want to darken the sky. Let's go ahead and take my cyans and my blues down a bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and lighten the foreground elements. I'm going to take my yellows over here to the right. And I'm actually going to take my reds a little bit to the left, because I wanted to sort of add a little contrast. So mix and match, bring some of that detail back, and kind of separate these two and see what I can get without going too far. Maybe a little more dark on the sky there to get this more contrasty, more impactful. I kind of like that. All right. So I just kept it simple. Just go ahead and create a high contrast version here using your black and white filter. But as I mentioned, if you wanted to get more specific, the best way to do that would be to apply this adjustment layer multiple times, have multiple adjustment layers, and then start exploiting these masks. Start hiding certain areas on each mask to control it and get you exactly what you want. Say, for example, if you wanted a higher contrast shop, but a lower contrast background, you could do that using selections and layer masks, similar to what we did on the previous lesson, while just using this black and white filter more than once. But for our purposes, I'm going to have you leave it there. Go ahead and just make these adjustments. Go ahead and close out your adjustment layer, but leave it intact. Now for the next process, I'm going to have you disable the black and white filter by turning it off. And that should send it back to color, back to where we started. And then I'm going to walk you through some things related to the older method of doing this using the channel mixer adjustment layer. Before we get into the channel mixer, I want to show you channels. Let's talk a little bit about them, because this gives me an excuse to sort of get a little technical on you and talk about channels. The color data that we're used to seeing in a color photograph in Photoshop is made up of 3 channels: red, green, and blue. And that data, when combined, gives you millions of colors. But in order to get that data, we have to have a combination of red, green, and blue mixed together. So when you break it down into specific colors, you can go ahead and turn off the visibility of the other colors and just leave one visible. You'll notice certain differences. Say, for example, I'm now looking at the red channel. And what we notice about the red channel is it's lacking in detail in here in the yellow brownish foreground, but has a lot of detail in the sky. In fact, I can even see the little power lines there that are almost invisible over here as well. And certainly the horizon is very clear down low, close to the mountains in the distance. All right, let's try the green channel. What does this have to offer? You notice the sky has a lot less detail. I can still see the little ribbons here, the little power lines, but it's a much lighter shade than it was in the red. But I've got more detail here in the foreground, and I've got quite a lot of detail in the rock shop still. It's more neutral, I would say. Now blue, on the other extreme, is more, you can see it as more the polar opposite of red. So now my sky has got very little detail. It's almost completely bleached. And I've got a lot of detail in these midtones in the sand. So if I compare this with the red, I can see they're kind of opposites of each other, whereas green is somewhere in the middle. So if I'm going to exploit the data here, I might be thinking more in terms of red or blue rather than green, unless I need something kind of in the middle, something neutral. Let's turn back all the channels just so you understand that temporarily. And you can see that when they're all combined, we get millions of colors, and this is the way we're used to seeing things. So what I'm going to do is play with a couple of these channels and then use the channel mixer to exploit the balance between these different channels. So let's start off by playing around a little bit with the red channel. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the green and blue channels. And by selecting the red channel, I'm going to be able to edit only the red channel. So why would that be of interest? Well, let's say, for example, I had some data I wanted to get rid of that only existed on the red channel. I could maybe paint it out or go ahead and borrow some better data from the green or blue channel and paste that over it to fix a problem like a line stain on a black and white photograph that was red, or perhaps a sun flare that only is visible on one channel and not the others. So there are times when you can exploit that. It's not a lot. It doesn't happen, every day, but certainly there are times when you can do that. But there's other things you can do by editing in specific channels. But one thing you have to be aware of is that when you go to channels, it doesn't automatically select the right layer. So I'm going to turn this back on to RGB. I'm going to go back to my layers, and I can see here is a big gotcha. And this is typically what happens to students is they forget to check this, is that if I want to edit channels, I have to be aware that it has to be on the right layer. Right now, it's not. It's on the adjustment layer that I just made, which is actually invisible. So if anything I do to this is not going to affect my photo because it's on the wrong layer. So let's do this. Let's copy the background layer, dragging it down to the new layer button so I won't destroy my original. And let's go ahead and select the background copy and start editing that one. So I'm going to go now to the channels, and I'm going to go to my red channel. Only my red channel should be selected, and only my red channel is visible. All right, now I'm going to go in and do something kind of unexpected. I'm going to go to Filter Blur, Gaussian Blur. And I'm only going to blur this one channel. I'm just going to give it a blur value that's fairly medium, fairly, nothing major, but certainly enough to be visible. So this is going to give, let's go ahead and start with, this is a small resolution photograph, so I don't need to go that high. Let's go with like 4, okay, 4 pixels. Click OK. You notice now I blurred this image quite a bit, but let's now reactivate all the channels and see what happens. And you can see when I do that I've actually created a kind of interesting distortion there. By blurring out that red channel, I've kind of thrown things off a bit, and I've got this kind of old-fashioned hand-rendered it almost looks like a camera mistake. It almost looks like kind of like a vintage 1940s era photograph. So that kind of gives you an interesting optical effect without using any filters. Kind of a fun little gimmick. All right, but let's say I want to go black and white with that. So in doing so, I'm going to exploit the channel mixer, because you'll notice the blue is still sharp, the green is still sharp, but my red is blurred. If I were to just go color with it, I get this really interesting color effect. As I mentioned, it gives you this kind of 1940s, 1950s vintage color look by kind of throwing it off and exploiting that red channel. But that's not what I'm looking for. I'm still going from color to black and white. So let's go back to layers. And now I'm going to add a new adjustment layer. This one time I'm going to choose the channel mixer. The channel mixer. That brings up this interface. And what this does is it allows me, once again, to go from color to black and white by clicking on the monochrome button. By clicking that button, I'm doing something similar to what I did with the black and white filter a moment ago. But now it's only using red, green, and blue information, and what it's doing is it's combining all three so that they equal 100. Now, I don't have to combine them to equal 100. That is simply so that I will maintain the original value structure of the original image. If I go over this number, I'm going to overexpose the image. If I go under that number, I will underexpose the image. And I'll show you that in a bit. But first, just understand what's happening here. So as I do this, I'm controlling the amount of data that comes from each channel. So if I wanted, let's just to show you how this works, I'm going to type in 0 on the blue, 0 on the green. You notice it goes dark, so now it's only got a combined total of 40%. So now I'm going to take the red to 100 to bring the values back. And so what I've done here is I've told Photoshop that I only want to use the visibility of one channel. So I'm just simply making a black and white photograph based upon one channel. In this case, I blurred it out. So let's see what happens, for example, if I were to go 0 on the red and 100 on the green. Now I'm just basically looking at my green channel. And so if I wanted simply to use one of these channels because I thought it was perfect, I had the right amount of detail in the sky, the detail in the earth is perfect, then I could just use this methodology and I'm done. But of course, that's not what we want to do. We're trying to get more towards an infrared photography look for this purposes of this exercise. So that means what I want to do is I want to give a little bit of a glow effect to that is similar to what you get with that kind of infrared photography look. Now, we don't have any green trees to utilize that, that's typically what photographers go for. A lot of grass or a lot of greenery, because when you shoot infrared photography, you get that very nice kind of white bleached look. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, maybe just Google infrared photographs to have a better understanding of infrared photography. I'm not trying to make this into anything fancy regarding infrared photography tutorials. That's not what this is. I just kind of want to go for that look. So I'll leave it there. But let's go ahead and bring out some of the red, some of the blurriness. And as you can see, as I bring this in, I'm getting kind of a glow effect. That Gaussian blur is starting to blur and make this glow and bleach out. But now I've got a combined total of 200%, which is overexposing my image. So let's bring down the green to get some more detail in there. I'm going to zoom out. And you can start to see this interesting kind of glow effect, which kind of replicates that infrared photography look. Now I'm going to bring in the blue and see what it can bring into the equation. I already know from looking at my plates before what each of these can bring. And I know that there's a lot of ground detail, for example, in the blue channel. So I'm going to bring down the green more because it's more neutral. Maybe there's too much red and too much glowing. I'll bring out more blue. So now the more of that blue that I bring forward, the more of that detail I'm getting in the sand. And so I've still got enough red that I can see the glow that I was going for, both in the sand and in around the edges of the shop. So I can just sort of play with these channels now that I've got one of them blurred and get a lot of very different looks. Here's kind of a bleached, really abstract, kind of interesting effect. Maybe this would be great for some hand painting, I can get some really interesting watercolor effects with this. Or maybe I want to have more detail, but just have some of that glow still present. Drop out more of that green, bring in some of that blue. And there I've got a nice glow effect that's subtle, but I can still see a lot of the photograph that's left. And so it's really kind of fun to play around with these settings and mix and match with using the channel mixer to get what you want. Now I've got to 140%. So it is definitely more overexposed than what I started with, but that's okay. I kind of like that, and I'm going to go with that for my infrared photography look. So they're not going to equal 100% in this case. Now, I didn't mention the constant slider, but if you want to darken or lighten everything globally, you can use this, and this will just basically take everything down a notch without mixing it. So I'm going to leave this neutral because I was happy with what I had before, but just so you know what that does. All right, I'm going to close this out. You can do the same. So these are my settings, 74, minus 38, and 105. And now I'm going to add a little bit of a tint to this because I mentioned as I've overexposed this, I've let a lot of white. I bleached out my sky. This lends itself to kind of a sepia toning. Let's try that out. So I'm going to add a final adjustment layer to the top of this pack. And I'm going to choose hue saturation. Hue saturation for my final adjustment layer. Let's choose colorize. And let's just pick a nice sort of sepia tone. I'm going to grab my hue and make it go towards like a brownish orange, something like that. Somewhere in that rust color area. Choose the amount of saturation that I want. Not too much. I don't want to go overkill with this, but just make it more subtle. And then just kind of lighten or darken it as I need to. That looks pretty good. Maybe drop the saturation a bit. Make it a little more subtle. There we go. I kind of like that look. It's kind of a brown, slight brownish tint. You don't have to use my exact numbers, but play around with your hue saturation settings and see what you get. See if you're able to get a really interesting looking tone to your black and white photograph, kind of a sepia toning process that we've settled on here for this final incarnation. So as you save this file, you're going to be turning in all of these layers intact, so I'll be able to go in. I can turn off your infrared look, and I can bring back your black and white conversion by itself. And in order to do that, I will need to shut off your blurred layer, although it's kind of a cool filter there. But no, this is the, remember, this was the first one we did with the black and white, visible only. And then now with these turned on, I can see your final infrared photograph. So save with everything intact, and we'll see you on the next round of tutorials.